Welcome to the 5th Annual Symposium on Spirituality and the Environment, hosted by Congregation Har Hashem in Boulder, Colorado. We thank David and Linda Bachrach for the generous endowment that funds this symposium each year. Hello, my name is Diana Lane, and I'm a member of Har Hashem, where I co-lead our Dayenu circle, which you'll hear a little more about later. Rabbi Green of Har Hashem is unable to be with us today because of illness, so I'm stepping in as moderator. He is on the mend, which we are all very grateful for. He is home, but not able to be at the event. So before we begin, I actually wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that here in Boulder, we are on the traditional territories and the ancestral homelands of Native peoples, including the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. As we are gathered here today to discuss spirituality and the environment, we want to acknowledge that the original inhabitants here in Boulder and in all parts of the United States had a deep spiritual connection to all aspects of the environment, including the lands, waters, and animals that sustain them. Ill treatment and forced removal of Native peoples at the hands of European settlers and the US government have disrupted, but not broken, these bonds. So let me tell you for a moment about how our time together today will unfold. In a moment, we will hear a welcoming message from David Bachrach, who sets the stage for the importance of this gathering and our conversation. And just so you know, that message was recorded Tuesday morning before the election had concluded. We will then have an invocation from Rabbi Deborah Bronstein, the Rabbi Emerita of Congregation Har Hashem. We will then be honored to have a keynote address from Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, who is the founder and CEO of Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. Rabbi Jennie Rosenn has spent more than 2 decades leading Jewish nonprofit organizations, advocating for social change and creating dynamic new initiatives at the heart of the Jewish social justice movement. Before founding Dayenu, Rabbi Rosenn served as vice president for community engagement at HIAS, where she built a robust Jewish movement responding to the global refugee crisis, which has its own connections to climate change as well. After the keynote, we will then have some time for questions from participants, and I hope we will have a lively discussion. Next up after that, we will have a conversation with Rabbi Rosenn and State Senator Steve Fenberg, giving us perspectives from the nonprofit sector and from the Colorado legislature. Steve Fenberg was elected to the Colorado Senate in 2016 and currently serves as the Senate Majority Leader, a leadership position he was elected to in 2018. Before entering the Senate, Steve served for a decade as the founding executive director for New Era Colorado, the largest state-based young voter mobilization organization in the country. State Senator Fenberg was deeply involved in groundbreaking climate legislation that passed in Colorado in 2019, and we'll be hearing a little bit more about that from State Senator Fenberg. After we have a little time for Rabbi Rosenn and Senator Fenberg to be in dialogue, there will be again additional time for questions from participants. So please be thinking about what you would like to ask and bring to the conversation. And we'll conclude by 3:30 Mountain Time. So again, thank you all for being here. And next up, we have a welcome from David Bachrach.
Sorry, it should be coming up in 1 second. Take 2 on the share. Here we go.
Linda and I welcome you to the 5th Annual Symposium on Spirituality and the Environment. This symposium was conceived as a forum for people who identify with a particular faith and for people of no particular faith. It is for all people who find a spiritual connection to our Mother Earth and all that she offers us in sustenance and in solace. Over the past 4 years, we've had speakers from all mainstream religions, Jews and Protestants, Catholics and Buddhists, Muslims and Hindus, Episcopalians and fundamentalist Christians, from organizations like Green Faith and Interfaith Power and Light, and a spokesman for the indigenous peoples of the world, whose land and resources have too often been pillaged for centuries in the name of progress. We've responded to feedback from past attendees who have felt moved to movement, to act, to engage our elected leaders to act on behalf of all of us to protect our Earth. We will ask you to give your feedback after today's session so that we may continue to refine this symposium in the future. Last year, our local congressperson, Joe Neguse, joined us, and today we're joined by Colorado State Senator and Majority Leader Steve Fenberg, as well as by Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, the founder and CEO of Dayenu, an organization that calls for climate action. Dayenu is a Hebrew word which means it would have been enough. But what we can do here today and in our lives as we go about our routines can seemingly never be enough. The background behind me is of the Calwood fire that burned 140,000 acres in the mountains northwest of Boulder. And when combined with other fires in the past 3 months, a total of more than 600 square miles have burned in our region. Not only were many homes lost, but the wonderful Calwood Education Center, where over the past 38 years, more than 135,000 10 to 12-year-olds have each received 30 hours of instruction in nature and the environment. Already closed since February 2020 due to COVID, this important resource for exposing our children to nature is further crippled by the fire that destroyed half of their 1,200 acres. But fortunately, their buildings were preserved by the brave firefighters who worked diligently to save them. It will be a long climb back for this second blow to the program, but it is important that the Calwood Education Center survive. As I record these words on welcome on the morning of Tuesday, November 3rd, on the morning of our nation's election day, I am filled with angst that the decades of ignoring what our Mother Earth requires to sustain her balance, her natural balance, what our nation and most nations have ignored and insulted for way too long, what our current administration has moved to undo during the past 4 years. I grieve and I ache. And yet I have hope that my children and grandchildren and your children and grandchildren will work together to take us to a better place environmentally and begin to repair the damage and put us on a path, a soft, resilient, earthen path that will lead to the restoration of respect for our Mother Earth, and with that respect, a cohesive movement that will bind us all in a common purpose to find our inner spirit, to live in harmony and balance with one another on this living, breathing sphere we call home. Thank you, and may the program begin.
Thank you so much, David, for those beautiful words. And Rabbi Bronstein, we welcome your invocation to get us going.
Thank you so much. You know, most of us know of Anne Frank through her diary written during the Holocaust. She and her family were hidden in the home of righteous Gentiles who risked everything to save their lives. When I read the paragraph I'm about to share with you, I was surprised because it was focused on nature, and I never think of Anne Frank in terms of the outdoors. And this year, it especially moved me because we've been so limited in our ability to go outdoors. This is what Anne Frank wrote. The best remedy for those who are afraid, lonely, or unhappy is to go outside, somewhere where they can be quite alone with the heavens, nature, and God. Because only then does one feel that all is as it should be, and that God wishes to see people happy amidst the simple beauty of nature. As long as this exists, and it certainly always will, I know that then there will always be comfort for every sorrow, and I firmly believe that nature brings solace in all troubles. Amidst the simple beauty of nature, as long as it exists, and it certainly always will, these words pain me, to be honest. We have done so much damage to the natural world. I'm afraid we cannot allow ourselves to believe that the natural world will always be our sanctuary, because we haven't treated it as a sanctuary. I pray that the teachings we receive today lead us to action throughout the year that will help us to mend the natural world. Let us pray that we do what we must to be repairers of the breach, so that our descendants may have the simple faith of Anne Frank. Kenny Rosenn.
Kenny Rosenn. Thank you so much. And we now turn to Rabbi Rosenn for your keynote address. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be with all of you this afternoon. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be together. Zeh hayom asa Adonai nagila v'nismecha vo. This is the day that Adonai has made. Let us exult and rejoice in it. I imagine many of us woke up this morning feeling differently than we have in many, many mornings. As Dave Pell quipped yesterday, a major victory for evangelicals as liberals across the country say, thank God. Well, most of us don't believe that God masterminded the outcome of the election any more than God put a climate denier in the White House 4 years ago. Many of us woke up this morning with immense gratitude to God, or to the source of all life, or to a higher power of some kind. And of course, gratitude for all of the people who worked tirelessly, and in some cases literally gave their lives to reach this moment in history. If your email looks anything like mine, subject lines this morning toggle between celebration and proclamations that we must roll up our sleeves and get to work immediately. For there's so many issues plaguing our nation, and both are true. Today is a day for celebration, and tomorrow we must get to work immediately. We have a chance to pull ourselves back from the brink. And the issue that if we don't address quickly and boldly will render all other issues irrelevant is the climate crisis. And we don't need to abandon other issues. Racism, the economy, the pandemic. In fact, they are deeply tied up with the climate crisis, not only in the causes, but also in the solutions. There's certain religious values that I think people think of when they think of environmentalism. The mandate to protect God's creation, to steward the earth, the prohibition to destroy or to waste. And these, of course, are powerful and important values. But at its core, the climate crisis is also about social, economic, and racial justice. It's about whether we believe that every human being is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, whether every human being deserves to have their most basic human needs met: air, food, water, shelter. Will we protect the most vulnerable? Will we choose blessing or curse, life or death? And at its most fundamental, confronting the climate crisis is about a commitment to humanity continuing, as we say in Jewish tradition, l'dor v'dor, generation to generation. These are just some of the values that call us to take collective action to confront the climate crisis, and why there's a growing movement of people of faith joining together to call our leaders to take bold action. And it's why we believe that justice must be centered in how we respond to the crisis. We must raise up a moral voice, powerful and clear. The climate crisis is the existential crisis of our time. We know the science. We read the staggering predictions of sea level rise. We feel the heat. We witness the floods and fires and hurricanes wreaking havoc across our nation and globe. And we know that without very significant changes, we are hurtling towards an unlivable and unsustainable future. Many are already experiencing the painful impacts of climate change. Even before the coronavirus pandemic hit, we knew our world was broken. We knew we couldn't just continue as we have been and expect that our children and grandchildren would have a safe planet to live on. But the deep disruption that's been caused by the coronavirus, in some ways it's put these truths into even sharper focus. We've experienced firsthand our profound interconnectedness. It's not abstract anymore. We have a new knowledge of what disruption feels like, of what happens when government fails to prepare and respond adequately, what happens when we don't listen to science. And the pandemic has awakened even the most comfortable among us to the fragility of our systems, our food, health, education, energy, even transportation systems. Many of us are getting in our kishkas, in our guts, in a new way, the threat of climate collapse. But this time of disruption and destruction has also given us a new opportunity. We have an unexpected chance to re-envision and rebuild the world, not to bolster the same unjust economies and polluting infrastructure, but to dream big, to envision and bring to life something profoundly different. And this is not only being shaped by the pandemic, of course. The uprisings for Black lives have put into sharper relief for many the systemic racism that pulses through our nation. It's heightened our awareness of the insidiousness of white supremacy and how Black, Brown, and Indigenous people bear the weight of injustice. The impacts of climate crisis rest disproportionately on those who've been historically marginalized, right? People living in the global South, in poverty, in particularly vulnerable areas, and people who experience racism and other forms of bigotry. It's like the climate crisis is a force multiplier, exacerbating historical inequities even as it impacts everyone. Justice and equity are essential to confronting the crisis, and like the coronavirus, none of us, regardless of wealth or skin color, is safe from the impacts. The climate crisis does not affect us all equally, but no one will be exempt. Confronting it in a way that's spiritually rooted means recognizing this truth of our interconnectedness, the powerful role of community, the importance of mutual support. It means centering social, economic, and justice, racial justice, and how we address it. And it also means highlighting this opportunity we've been given to re-envision and rebuild a different kind of future, something that's at the core, really, of all religious traditions, acknowledging the world as it is and imagining the world as it could be, as it should be. Encountering the climate crisis from a place of the spirit also means recognizing and honoring the way in which it is profoundly overwhelming. It is difficult to face the truth of what is at stake. It simply can be too much to take in. So we disassociate, we turn away, we distract ourselves in the busyness of our day-to-day lives with to-do lists and Netflix. How can our souls and psyches bear the devastation that is happening on our planet? The loss, the march towards more and more destruction, the fear and anxiety of what the future holds for our children and grandchildren. If some look away, others can't look away. 2 weeks ago, I received an email from an old friend who told me his 2 young adult daughters were personally in crisis, wondering why they should do anything for the future, feeling doomed. A millennial journalist, Paul Bowers, noticed a trend on Twitter a few months ago. He explained that the basic formula goes like this: mundane task plus impending doom equals what's the point? He starts with his own. He says, I took on some new responsibilities at work today and I made it to the gym and I remembered to floss this morning, but oh my God, who cares? The world is ending anyway. Emma Ramadan tweets, finished a big translation project this morning and was excited for all of 3 minutes, then read it was 84 degrees near the Arctic Ocean this weekend. So nothing matters, and I'm genuinely unsure of how to continue with daily routines and tasks without feeling utterly ridiculous. Unprecedented fires, destruction, and toxic smoke in the West, devastating 6 million acres, including in Colorado. Soaring heat waves, flooding in the South, where a series of slow-moving storms have left entire communities underwater. Multiple brutal hurricanes in Louisiana. And this is just in recent weeks. Climate change is here, sooner than we thought, more violent than we ever imagined. And without massive change, we are hurtling towards a world in which much of the earth will become uninhabitable. There will not be enough food to eat or clean air to breathe and water to drink, and many major cities will be underwater. Many of us across the generations are facing deep questions, the kind that keep us up at night as we face this existential crisis. I imagine that among us here gathered this afternoon, there are real differences in how we're experiencing this. One of these differences might be generational. For those in the later third of their life, boomers, many feel a sense of sadness and guilt about what they are leaving to the next generation, aware that they will not be here to bear the brunt of what's ahead. For millennials and Gen Z kids, this is all they've ever known. Many are understandably angry, also fired up, fully active. Some feel hopeless. They're the authors of the tweets I just shared. And Generation X, for us, the world is not as we thought it was. The narrative we grew up with, that things would keep improving, turned out to be completely wrong. In addition to worrying about our children and grandchildren, many of us are mourning the world as we knew it, as we thought it was. Of course, these are generalizations, and each person is facing the climate crisis in their own unique way. But many of us are asking a few basic questions. How do we live during this time? How do we face the truth? What's going to happen to us, to our earth, to future generations? What can I possibly do? Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action, the organization I lead, seeks to support people to grapple with these questions in community, with space and resources to face the truth, feel the feelings, begin to metabolize this growing reality. And Dayenu gives people pathways to take meaningful political action, because a significant part of how we live in the face of this truth is by taking action in community, grounded in spirit. One of the ways to subvert these feelings of hopelessness and overwhelm is by acting as part of a larger movement. Many of us know that feeling, that amazing feeling of being one small part of a larger body of people, coming together to take meaningful action. Maybe it's text banking to help people make plans to vote, and then seeing your numbers at the end of the night add to tens of thousands of others who are doing the same thing. Or singing together at a rally or action, our voices rising. This may be harder to do in this time of physical distancing, but even on Zoom, we can feel the ways in which we are one small part of a bigger whole, a growing movement, a movement of people who can make change. The story at the core of the Jewish people's narrative is a journey out of Mitzrayim, Egypt, or literally Mitzrayim in Hebrew means a narrow place, a place of oppression and genocide, like so many people have faced. While wandering in the desert, God reminds us that the path forward and our redemption is not in the heavens or beyond our reach. Lo b'shamayim hi. Our redemption is in our hands. In Deuteronomy, God says, it is not too baffling for you or beyond your reach. It is not in the heavens or beyond the sea. No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart to do it. The future of the world is in our hands. It's in our hands as in it's on us. It's up to us. And also it's in our hands. We have the capacity. We have the science. We have the resources. We have the people, and we have the power. We have the opportunity to close the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be, not by inching the two closer together incrementally, but by reimagining and rebuilding a different future. And boy, have we taken things into our own hands. Climate activists from Sunrise to Interfaith Power and Light, Green Faith, to Dayenu's own Chutzpah 2020 campaign mobilized millions of Americans to vote with climate in mind. And they did. More than 75.5 million people turned out to vote for a presidential candidate who made confronting the climate crisis a central promise of his campaign. The polls indicate that climate was a real factor in this election. Dayenu's Chutzpah 2020 nonpartisan Get Out the Vote campaign mobilized 800 volunteers across the country, from Jewish middle schoolers to boomers, to reach out to 750,000 climate-concerned voters in key states, and call on leaders to have the chutzpah, the audacity, to take bold action on climate on day one. This is now the work ahead. We must ensure that the President-elect Biden prioritizes climate on day one and makes this an absolute top priority of his presidency. We do not have time to waste. With a split Senate or a slightly right-leaning Senate, most likely, federal climate legislation will be difficult. Not impossible, but definitely difficult. And probably the most promising pathways to climate action will likely be through executive orders, agency actions, and by adding climate provisions to other kinds of congressional bills like stimulus, energy, farm, transportation, and such. The scale and speed of this kind of effort really depends on how much political capital the Biden administration and congressional Democratic leadership want to spend on climate action and how quickly they will move on it. And this is where we all come in. Over the next 6 to 12 months, we must press the Biden administration and Democratic leadership to take an aggressive, urgent approach to the climate crisis, to put millions of people back to work building 100% clean energy by 2035, to make massive investments in infrastructure, transportation, clean tech, and sustainable agriculture, to regulate fossil fuel aggressively, to hold Wall Street accountable for its role in propping up the fossil fuel industry, and shifting finance so it invests in clean, renewable energy. There's a race to the top for states and municipalities to lead the clean energy revolution, and so many towns and cities in Colorado are leading the way on this. And our leaders must prioritize environmental justice, ensuring that communities and tribal nations that have borne the brunt of environmental racism and historical inequities are made whole and prioritized in the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And finally, of course, it goes without saying, we must rejoin the Paris Agreement and become a leader on climate on the world stage. We must make a moral and political case that a slow, plodding, incremental approach to climate action essentially condemns the planet, our communities, and future generations to tremendous suffering and ultimate destruction. How can we do this? We can do this by getting involved and organizing our friends and family and neighbors to get involved in making systemic change. As Diana mentioned, there are Dayenu circles forming across America, including one right at Har Hashem. And through Dayenu circles, you can engage in national Dayenu campaigns that will be taking on this work in the coming months and years, with training and resources and opportunities to join with other Dayenu circles across the country, bringing the full power of the American Jewish community to the climate movement, being one piece of a much bigger whole. Beyond the Jewish community, I encourage you to check out Boulder Green Faith Circle. Green Faith, I think there are actually some folks here today who may be involved in this very important multi-faith work. And in a few minutes, we'll have the opportunity to hear from State Senator Fenberg, who will share his insights about critical local work and action that is needed. But most of all, I urge you to get involved with organizations and efforts that are making systemic change. In order to mitigate the most devastating impacts of climate change and to avert total climate collapse, we need to take action on a systemic level. Because while personal practices like reducing meat consumption and communal practices like greening institutions, these are important. But if every single person and institution significantly lowered their carbon footprint, we would not avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. By way of example, in the middle of April, when more than half the world was homebound due to coronavirus, carbon dioxide emissions only fell about 17%. The other 83% of emissions are embedded deeply in our economy. And to address that, we have to make change on a systemic level. This means things like cutting demand for and supply of fossil fuel energy, advocating for comprehensive climate policy on the federal and state level, moving our money and changing our political landscape. Electing a president who's committed to averting the worst of climate disaster is a critical start, but it's only the beginning. And if we stop here, we will not, as we say in the High Holiday Liturgy, we will not avert the severity of the decree. This is the time when leaders and communities and all of us must raise up a moral voice for bold, not incremental action. We need responses and solutions at the scale and speed that science and justice demand, and none of us can sit this out. We need a powerful climate movement that is spiritually rooted, multi-generational, bold, and centers justice. We named Dayenu as a double entendre. As many of you know, and was referenced earlier, Dayenu is the song of gratitude we sing each year at the Passover Seder, when we retell the story of the Jewish people's journey from slavery to freedom. It recounts all the things that God has done for us. God had taken us out of Egypt and not given us the Torah. Dayenu goes on like this. It would have been enough. But Dayenu also means we've had enough. We've had enough destruction. We've had enough valuing of fossil fuel companies over human life. We've had enough of letting the impacts of climate destruction fall disproportionately on Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor, and marginalized communities. We've had enough. Dayenu. But it can also mean we have enough. We have what we need to confront the climate crisis and move towards climate solutions. We have the resources and policy rubrics and technology. We have what we need so that everyone can have enough. So I want to close with the words again from Deuteronomy. Lo b'shamayim hi. It is not beyond us in heaven. It is in our hands and in our hearts, and we can do it. Now is the time to join together in this urgent and sacred work. Nothing less than the future of humanity is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a beautiful call to action that we all need in this moment. So we have about 12 minutes or so for some questions and discussion. And I invite people, I think the easiest thing to do is if you would like to ask a question, to please just put a Q in the chat, and then we can see your name, and I will call on you. And you can unmute, or if you are very shy, or for other reasons that you don't want to speak up, doesn't have to be being shy, could have a barking dog, or whatever. You are welcome to also just put your question in the chat, and I can ask the question on your behalf, but we would rather hear people's voices if you are willing to do that. And Becky O'Brien will get us started. Thank you, Becky. And Jonathan, maybe you can help find people to unmute them. Or maybe people can unmute themselves. I'm not actually sure.
I think people can unmute themselves, yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
I just unmuted myself fine.
Terrific.
Thank you, Diana. Welcome, Rabbi Rosenn, to Boulder virtually. Sorry you can't be here in person, but it's probably better for the environment that we're doing it this way. So my question is, I was so excited this morning as I'm reading about the transition website of President-elect Biden, and he names 4 issues that are like the top priority, and climate's there. And I'm like, oh, thank God. I just, the hope was like, and what I'm curious about from your perspective is how I remember 4 or 5 years ago lobbying hard to even just get a question asked in the debates around and in the primaries around climate change, and here it was featured in both debates, and like here we are. And so I'm curious both how much you think things have changed, and how did we get here? How did we make the progress that we have made, which in some ways is so impressive, and in other ways, like not remotely enough yet.
And maybe before you jump into answer, I will just ask people, just so we kind of work to create a sense of community in our time together. If you ask a question, if you'd like to introduce yourself, you can introduce yourself any way that you want.
And I'm Becky O'Brien, and I'm a member of Harshem's Dayenu circle.
Becky also was a very stalwart volunteer with Chutzpah 2020. So great to see you, Becky. It's a great question. I think things are significantly different. And I think that there's a whole series of things that happened since the last election. I think that the IPCC report, I know that sounds really wonky, but I actually think it was one of the first to break through in the news cycle about it being sooner and harsher than even the scientists predicted. I think that that was a real kind of opening. I also think that the media started to cover the issue. Thank you, International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I think that the media also began to cover it quite differently. And interestingly, that's also, having worked on refugee issues, that is also a big shift that happened with the refugee crisis. You might remember that there was sort of this moment when everyone woke up. The refugees were not new. People just woke up to it in a different kind of way. And you might remember that iconic picture of the little boy, the Syrian refugee. I think that similarly, the media actually played, there's a lot of harshing on the media. I think the media played a really significant role in this. I also think, sadly, that people in places of privilege started to experience the impacts themselves. I think that there has been severe impacts for a long time among lots of communities, but I think as more and more of the America's elite started to experience the direct impacts, I think that also caused a real shifting. So all of those things I really think conspired. And then you have the student activists and the Sunrise Movement and the student strikes and the way in which a whole generation seized this moment and these opportunities and turned it into political power. And that actually shifted, as often happens, older generations' consciousness as well.
Thank you. And there's a question from Marcy Smith in the chat. How significantly does natural gas fracking impact climate change? Can fracking still be part of the energy mix?
So I am actually going to, it's obviously a very politically ripe question, right? It's been this sort of dividing line with Biden and Harris. I am not a fracking policy expert, nor do I play one on TV. So I really can't, I think in good conscience, talk about some of the technical amount that it contributes. It's obviously a not insignificant player. And I would guess that Senator Fenberg will be able to answer that question with much more technical depth than I will. Thanks, it's a great question, Marcy.
Thanks, so maybe we'll hold on to that one for the conversation part. So we'll keep that. Dara, did you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, Dara Jordan Davies, for those of you who don't know me. Well, I put a question or a comment in the chat. I've been talking to people for a long time now about addressing climate change and addressing racism at the same time by focusing our efforts and our money and so on poor communities of color, cleaning those up so that people in those communities will have work. People in those communities will have clean water and a safer life, and that the leadership of those communities should be in charge of it instead of having, if it's okay to say this, white people who are experts like coming in and saying, do this, do this, do this. Safe housing would spending money on safe housing would bring decent housing to those communities and make it easier. I don't know if we'd put the rebuilding schools in that area, but they're unsafe. So that might be a part of climate change and upgrade them for poor kids. So that's my idea, and I just want to ask what other people think about it.
Diana, it sounded like a question for the
Yes.
group. I'm happy to.
I
Dara was inviting other folks who might have perspectives on this. I think as I shared, I think that you're absolutely right, and that these two things are deeply, deeply connected. And it's both the impacts that they're experiencing now in poor communities and communities of color. It's also about, as we move towards renewable energy, how are those communities prioritized, both in terms of the source of their energy, but also in terms of jobs and investing in renewable energy. And as you said, how much are communities part of the decision-making process? And so there's a whole network of mostly local, very, powerful climate justice organizations rooted in local communities that have a really important, very important role to play in both the decision-making and how the transformation happens. And that's why, so Dayenu has two North Stars, I would say. One is reaching net zero emissions at the very latest by 2050, very latest. And the other is a just, green, and equitable energy economy. And it's that second part that really speaks to what you're speaking about, Dara. It can't just be about emissions. It has to be about what the economy looks like that we're building.
Yes, right. So I wonder, what is the first step on this? Do we write letters to Mr. Biden? I'm not really deeply connected with any organization, but I know there are. So what is the first step? What do I do first to get this started?
So I think the first thing is to join together with other folks. Dayenu, like I think all climate organizations right now, are quickly gearing up for this next moment. We've done a lot of scenario planning of A, B, C, D, E. I think there's a whole lot of figuring out what role Georgia is going to play, how much sort of energy and resource should be put there initially. I think there are going to be campaigns. I know that Dayenu is, we're creating them, as are all of the climate action organizations for these coming months, to put that kind of pressure. But again, I would just really encourage folks to get engaged as part of a group. It doesn't have to be Dayenu, it can be another group. But I think the power of the collective from both a spiritual and a political perspective is so critically important. And it also ensures then that you're partnering with communities on the front lines. So for example, one of the first resources that we developed for Dayenu circles that are forming are resources about how do you partner effectively with local frontline grassroots communities? How do you not show up in the way that you were just talking about, Dara, where we have the answers, here we are, how can we, right? But to really listen and to really think about how do we bring the power of a diverse Jewish community, but still a predominantly, white, more affluent community. And that plays out in other faith groups as well in different ways, to really partner in deep ways to bring that political power.
Okay.
Thank you. A rich discussion that, we could, I think with every question, we'll, kind of wish we had more time to dig in even deeper. Harry Gregory asks in the chat, says, very strong message, Rabbi Rosenn. How do you reconcile your call for bold, not incremental action with 100% renewable energy by 2035? 15 years is too slow to prevent unstoppable tipping points.
So there is a tremendous amount of debate among even organizations that line up very similarly in a lot of ways about kind of how much by what date. And every organization, I think, and leader is balancing what needs to happen to avert the worst with what is possible. I sort of think it's like I have this image of it's like a scale and a spectrum at the same time. So our assessment, and here I should say I come to this as a rabbi, as a Jewish social justice leader. My partner, Phil Aranyanu, was one of the co-founders of 350.org. Worked there for many years, ran campaigns, most recently the ACLU. So he came on as my partner in February, and has done a lot of analysis, both politically and technically, about where that point should be. Landed at 100% renewable by 2035, and know that there are people who say 2050, there are people who say 2030. I think what's most important in all of this is that it is bold and fast enough to actually bring about the kind of change we need, and not so fast that we leave poor and communities of color, in the wake. And that's the balancing act.
Thank you. We have more things that are getting queued up in the chat, but I also want to make sure that we have time to hear from State Senator Fenberg, and some time for conversation between the two of you, and some more time for questions. So I would ask, Sarah Jane is next up. So if you can jot down your question so you don't forget it, you'll then have the opportunity to ask it of either Rabbi Rosenn or State Senator Fenberg, or both, when we get there. And Vance and Carol also asked for the opportunity to make a comment, which we will leave space for as well. But if there's something that you want to type into the chat that feels particularly timely right at this moment, feel free to do that. So we will turn to State Senator Fenberg. I gave a little introduction. We appreciate that, as we noticed before, that you are in your workshop with your young infant in the house. So climate work happens in all spaces. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Rabbi Rosenn, for your remarks and all of the work that you've been doing. And it's really good to see all of you. It's a funny way to have this conversation over Zoom when some of us are in our shed, some of us are on our couches. But it's good to see all of you, and thanks for zooming in for this incredibly important conversation. I guess what I'll do is a pretty engaged group, and I know there's a lot of questions. And so what I think maybe I'll do to make sure we have the best use of our time is I'll kind of give a quick overview of the political landscape in Colorado, given the results from Tuesday, and talk a little bit about what Colorado has been doing recently on the climate front from a more legislative policy perspective, and where we're headed, and then kind of open it up to some of these bigger conversations and questions that we've been having, that we've started with the rabbi. So, so first of all, my name is Steve Fenberg, and I'm sure people are from a variety of places, but if you live in the city of Boulder, or in the mountains above Boulder, in Niwot, in those types of areas of Boulder County, then you're probably your senator. And I first got elected in 2016. I was just on the ballot this past Tuesday. So thank you for those of you who voted for me. And, when I ran in 2016, I really thought we were going to be entering a different moment in our country's history and trajectory on so many of these important issues. I think everybody felt that way, but from the national level on down. But in 2016, we actually didn't have a Democratic-controlled state Senate either. And we thought we would flip it, and we would be part of this this kind of national movement, and we'd have Hillary Clinton as our president, and so much progress was going to continue from what started under the Obama administration. Obviously, things didn't turn out the way we thought they would that year. And that is actually true in Colorado as well. We stayed in the minority as Democrats in the state Senate. So I immediately knew once I first stepped foot in that Senate chamber that we were going to have to do a lot of work to build bridges with the Republicans that were in charge of the Senate, to work towards the next election to hopefully win a couple of more seats so we could get some more action done. And luckily in 2018, we did flip the Senate. And that's also when Governor Polis was elected as our governor. So in Colorado, we are in a situation, if you're a progressive, if you're a Democrat, where we sort of are living in the golden age for when it comes to Colorado Democrats. We, for the almost first time in many, many decades, we have control of just about every section of government, from the Attorney General, the Governor's Office, the Treasurer, Secretary of State, the State House, the State Senate. As of Tuesday, we Democrats, for the first time in a generation, took over the majority of the CU Board of Regents, which seems kind of wonky and not that important, but that is our flagship research institution, and a lot of climate science and research comes out of there, and sometimes is maybe not all of it actually does come out of there, depending on who's in charge, right? And so we live in a state right now that, just in terms of elected office, is very blue. And we, in this past election, we won the state, or we kept the state Senate in Democratic hands. We actually grew it by a seat. So we have a slightly larger majority. And we, in 2018, when we got that majority in the first place, we knew climate was absolutely going to have to be at the top of the agenda. Partially because we knew the federal government really was not going to be helping us, and we can't really waste any time on this one. As folks have been saying, this is a existential crisis for humanity across the world, but here at home, it is impacting us much more than a lot of places. Obviously, we know that climate change has a disproportionate impact on communities of color and low-income folks. But it also has a disproportionate impact just simply based on geography, right? And in Colorado, we just finally are about to be putting out these fires, hopefully. And the reason why they have been so bad is because of climate change. It is not a, one dot connected to the other necessarily, but there's a few dots in there, and all of the scientists and the experts say this is a problem related to climate change. And so this is impacting our backyards, this is impacting our homes, our communities, absolutely impacting our economy, and it's impacting, frankly, our health. I just had a baby 10 months ago. She was born actually with some respiratory issues, and she's fine now, but it was kind of scary at first. And for the first time, I personally had to really pay attention to the ozone levels and the air quality alerts that come up on our, on our phones every day. Most of my life, I would see that and be like, I don't even really know what ozone is, but it seems fine outside to me. I can breathe, I can do whatever, because these are invisible toxins in a lot of ways. It really hit close to home for me when I had a vulnerable person in my home now, in my family, that I think twice about even just leaving my house. And so this is something that is impacting all of us. And when I ran for office, I never really wanted to be a politician. I never thought I would be in elected office. I thought I would always be one of those kind of rabble rousers behind the scenes, arguing with people like me. But now all of a sudden I put on a suit and go to the Capitol every day. But when I ran, I figured, the only reason why I'm doing this is because I can represent a place like Boulder County, where I feel like I can truly every single day go to the Capitol and work on the values and the issues that I hold near and dear, because I know my community has my back. And when I don't do the right thing, they'll absolutely hold me to account and remind me why I am there. And so we have made some big strides. We have gotten a lot done. As someone said in the Q&A, it feels a little too long-term for the severity of the problem that is facing us. And I agree wholeheartedly. We need to do more. And what I would say, I know we're gonna talk a little bit about what people can do in these moments and what's the best use of your time and your energy and your resources. Everybody needs to play a role, right? It doesn't mean everyone's role will be being a state senator or being at the protest every single day when there is one, or keeping up to date on all this Twitter and Facebook groups and the happenings and everything and who said what. And everybody should play a role in this crisis because it is the absolute only way we're going to get past it. So whatever role it is that you decide, and I will say nobody should be off the hook. Everybody needs a role in this fight. Whatever it is, just do it well. If you're going to be an elected official, if you're going to be an activist, if you're going to mobilize friends and family, if you're going to be a researcher, if you're going to work in the faith community to organize that aspect of our lives, we all have to give it absolutely everything, because this problem is only going to be solved if we do it collectively. When I think about climate and the crisis that is upon us and spirituality, and to everybody that means something slightly different, I think on one hand you can sort of immediately be mobilized into action, right? Because it is a moral an unjust thing that we are doing to ourselves and to our loved ones and to the planet. I also think it's easy to think about it from a spiritual perspective and even like get to a place where you feel like this is so big and beyond what you as an individual can do, and it's overwhelming. When I think about climate and spirituality, I often think about, I find myself thinking about that, the phrase, "this too shall pass," because that's, I don't know why, but it's the concept that comes to my mind when I think about these huge existential problems. Whenever there's gun violence or a major catastrophic event, I often think of those words, "this too shall pass." And of course, like as Americans, we often think of Abraham Lincoln, and he had that in his speech about sort of where we were as a country when he was running for president. It's actually it predates that, right? Many of us know it actually is sort of an old fable from ancient Israeli times. And it's sort of this concept of, the king told somebody that I'm going to probably butcher the story, but it basically said, find me, a ring or a piece of jewelry that when a heartbroken person looks at it, it gives them hope. And when someone who is celebratory looks at it, it kind of brings them down a peg. And that was the charge. And the individual, went all over and finally found this one ring when he asked a poor shopkeeper, and they showed them this ring, and within it is the inscription said, "This too shall pass." Meaning, right, that when horrible things happen, sometimes we have to give ourselves some perspective. And I think in some ways you can, and then, when amazing things happen, you have to give yourself perspective too, because it's not always going to feel so good. There will be challenges ahead, right? So it's a phrase that works on both sides. What I would say though is that sometimes that makes you feel like, well, we have these insurmountable problems. And we also know from science that in the end, this is actually not a planet Earth problem. This is a human problem, because in the span of time of planet Earth, Mother Earth is going to be just fine, right? If you just wait several 100 million years, planet Earth is going to figure its stuff out and heal itself eventually. Obviously, that's not what we want to rest on. But it also, to me, instead of "this too shall pass," what I think about in these moments is it you thinking about it in a way that's slightly different, and thinking about it in the terms of "this too shall be overcome." Because for me, "this too shall pass" is way too passive and often can get us to a place where we get overwhelmed and result in inaction. And I think, Rabbi, you were reading someone's tweet about, these major issues, and then all of a sudden you're going about your day and you feel kind of silly worrying about like what's on TV that night or what you're going to do for the weekend. But if we think about it more from "this too shall be overcome," I think that is something that we can remind ourselves over and over again to snap us out of it and realize that collectively we actually have to play a role here to overcome it. This is not something that we can just sit back and let fix itself, unless anybody plans to live for 300 million years. This is something we all have to grasp collectively to overcome together. That means we need to do bold action, not just in our lives, but also on the policy front. And what I would say before I pass it over to Q&A and discussion, is we also need to keep in mind that this, from a political perspective, this is no longer Democrats versus Republican, or at least it shouldn't be. And if we look at it that way, we are fighting the last war rather than the war that is upon us. And by that, I mean, we often here in Colorado, like I was saying, this is sort of like a Democratic golden age. So it's not the Republicans necessarily getting in our way of doing more bold action, but it is the structures that we as humans have created and built for hundreds of years. And it's incredibly difficult to take those structures down in a course of a couple of years, which we all know is essentially what we're talking about. We need bold action over the course of a couple of years. And by that, I mean, we know the scientists have told us what we have to do. We need to stop emitting emissions. We need to shut down the coal plants. We need to stop fracking. We need to get rid of internal combustion engines and replace them with electric vehicles. We know all of that. It's actually not that complicated from a science or policy perspective, right? The complicated part is telling that coal worker that we're going to shut down his mine because there's this, like, you know, immoral conundrum that is upon us, and it's just going to be better for everybody if he doesn't have a job anymore. Or, you know, shutting down the coal plant down in Pueblo, which the community relies on for hundreds of millions of dollars of tax revenue to fund schools and roads and basic services. That is our opponent in a lot of ways, is the structure that we have set up and allowed to persist that people are so reliant on. And it makes it really hard for representatives, for elected officials, to force drastic change overnight upon their constituents, because we know that if people don't actually want it and it's forced, that elected official will just simply be out of a job next time around. And then we may have not actually solved anything. So the question really is, how do we transform this? How do we fight this battle and figure out what role we all have to play when the opponent in a lot of ways is ourselves and the systems that we collectively have built up and probably still support every single day with our actions in one way or another. And I think that is the more complicated question than just how do we beat Republicans at the ballot box, or how do we pass a bill? Because we did pass House Bill 1261, we did pass Senate Bill 181 and Senate Bill 204 and many other energy and climate related bills in Colorado, but they do take time to implement, and they're definitely not perfect. And they, I think some people could call them incremental change rather than transformative immediate change. And so those are the kind of the struggles. Those are the things we need to balance, is how do we have bold, quick, drastic changes occur, knowing that government traditionally is not typically the venue where those types of big changes happen, right? Usually they are forced upon a system by people. So we need to think about what actually gets change done. What is our role to advance that change faster than it would otherwise? And how do we get government to follow the will of the people in a way that the folks who disagree with us, not just Republicans, but labor unions or workers or low-income communities, are not necessarily asking for us, let's say, for instance, to get rid of all their jobs in the fossil fuel sector overnight, because that does have an economic impact. How do we balance all those needs in those and push those levers to get us somewhere that we all know we need to get to as fast as possible? And what I would just say is, in closing, before we open it up for discussion, is I think there's a big lesson. There are lots of lessons to be learned about this last week in this election. And our country is clearly incredibly divided. Yes, Joe Biden won and got a historic amount of votes, but almost the same amount of people voted for the other guy. What does that mean? And how do we move forward in a way that is sustainable on these changes? Because we actually got some good changes done under the Obama administration. Almost all of them were reversed or halted. And nothing really has happened for 4 years. So how do we do it this time around in a way where we don't just end up right exactly where we are now, or where we were in 2010 when there was a bad midterm, or when Donald Trump won. How do we make sure we do this in a way that is inclusive, but still bold, and so that we can bring people along with us to make this change last for more than just one presidential election? So those are our challenges. Looking forward to chatting more and discussing what all of our roles can be and what the different role options might be in the near future.
Thank you so much. Really great to hear your perspective as, kind of we look at this post-election landscape, in Colorado specifically, and in the US. I wonder, Rabbi Rosenn, if you just have anything that in Senator Fenberg's remarks that kind of spoke to that you want to respond to for a moment, and then maybe from there we will turn back to people's questions. I made a list of questions, but I think I'd rather hear from all the other attendees.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Fenberg. That was very both comprehensive and deep, which is hard to do in a short period of time. I'm really struck by what you were saying about it not being a question of the Republicans, it being a question of the structures that we've built that can't change quickly. And I think that there are two things that really come to mind. One is we need to be creating another vision of what it looks like, that it's not simply what we're losing, because I think people can't change only by loss or by fear of some abstract future, particularly when a lot of those folks are living with day-to-day, food on the table, rent, family, kids, healthcare. So some abstract climate future to give that up. But I think the more that we collectively, both the nonprofit sector, faith communities, government, can begin to create much more compelling and robust visions of what a green economy looks like and brings, I actually think, people have a lot of things to say about AOC, but I actually think that video that she made, or that she and her team made, really stands out as like kind of a quirky but inspiring picture of what it could look like. So I think there's a lot of, someone also put in the chat about visioning, concretizing, giving people a picture of what's possible, and that it's something that people want, because I think that people are open to change if it brings some of what they actually want and need, which I believe these solutions do. And the other is, going back to the impact of the pandemic, we have seen, it's not easy, it's not universal, but we have made changes that were unimaginable. If someone had said to us a year ago, kids are mostly going to be going to school from their bedrooms, we would have said, like, what the hell are you talking about? People are going to be working from, everyone's going to be walking around masks. There has been massive change because it was made imminently necessary. And so I think there too is a question of it's possible. And I think there's more for us to learn about what we can kind of milk from this horrible experience that can inform how we make fast change as a nation and a world when we need to.
Thank you. I want to go back to Sarah Jane.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You can introduce yourself for a second first.
All right, I've already introduced myself to Rabbi Rosenn because we're kissing cousins, which is wonderful. I'm very proud of that. I'm Sarah Jane Cohen. I'm a member of Har Hashem. I have been involved with the Social Justice, or Tikkun Olam Committee since I started it, really. I'm proud to say 20 some odd years ago. My question is this. My husband and I live in a modest sized house. We have one car. It is not an electric car, but it's one car, and we owned the last one for 20 years, and I hope we'll own this one for 20 years, which is not so good for the environment, but that's another story. And, we don't eat meat. We try very hard to be personally climate responsible in the ways that we can be. And we vote for the right people, we write letters, we make phone calls, we text, we do all of that stuff. We support the right organizations. But I feel that that there must be more that we can do. And one of the things, particularly Rabbi Rosenn, when you were talking about how, finally some of these climate issues are affecting people, more comfortable communities, people of privilege. And I'm probably one of those people. What can we do as investors? And I'm not talking big, Bloomberg investors. I'm talking about modest investors, people who have retirement accounts with a few hundred shares here and a couple of hundred shares there. But what can we do to let the companies that we are invested in know that we deeply care about these issues? That even though, yes, we're invested in an automobile company or an energy company or a manufacturing company, that doesn't mean that we don't care how they do their work and how they generate their income that will hopefully make the stock go up and keep the dividends flowing. So anyway, so that's my question. Or am I being totally naive?
I have a very short answer, and then I want to hand it over to Senator Fenberg, who I suspect has a much more in-depth response. So we haven't actually talked a lot this afternoon about the role of the fossil fuel industry and the way in which they actually have played an incredible role for decades in getting us to this point, with some very intentional, I always pronounce this word wrong, obfuscation, obscuring, and worse. And I think that we are all, unbeknownst to us, actually funding the fossil fuel industry through the very things you're talking about, through our investments, through our banking, and it's not only the industries, it's the financial institutions and the insurance companies and all of the financial infrastructure. And so fossil fuel finance is actually, it sounds really wonky, but it actually is an incredibly powerful lever for us to collectively be pulling. It's a strategy that Dayenu is actually likely to be leaning into in these coming years, it particularly if we have less traction on a federal policy front, depending on what happens with the Senate. And the fossil fuel industry is actually in a more precarious state than it has been in a very long time. And that also creates an opening. Somebody put in the chat the Stop the Money Pipeline campaign, which is actually Dayenu's works very closely with. And that's a great example of collectively leveraging that. And I think that what I like about fossil fuel finance kind of as a lever and a strategy is that it, to Senator Fenberg's point about everybody has a role to play, there are actions that need to be happening where people are sitting in and literally doing direct action, civil disobedience. And there's a role for a mother and kid to be going into Chase banks across their town, having conversations, right? So there's a lot of different ways that activism can look. So yes, I think that's a critically important piece. And I think we're going to be hearing more and more in the coming years. I think this strategy, hopefully, God willing, is going to grow more and more traction.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's just to add on to that, there are entities or organizations that help people know where their money is truly going and how to avoid certain types of investments in, for instance, fossil fuel industry. There's also a growing movement to do that on the institution level, right? To make sure that pensions pull out their investments. It's something we were probably on track to do last year in the legislature, and then coronavirus hit, and that and many other things just had to sit on the back burner for the rest of that session. And that's when it comes to the PARA in Colorado, the Public Employees Retirement Association. So there are those types of things that if you are a member of, you may not yourself have direct ability to decide which mutual funds or which investments your pension or your retirement goes into, but you can play a role by teaming up with other members to put pressure on the institution to do it for you. So that's one thing to consider as well. Other people have looked at it from for CU as well, because obviously CU has a large endowment and things like that.
As Dayenu's developing our strategy around this, we are looking both at individuals and at institutions, because all of the faith groups that are represented on this call have enormous, in varying degrees, pension funds. All churches and synagogues have investments. Like, you can kind of go through, all federations have investments. We actually were gearing up for a pretty significant take on the institutional level. With the economic fallout, it's a little bit trickier to get right now in this particular moment to get major institutions that are already feeling, a significant pinch in this moment. But it's certainly the next frontier, and it's the level on which it needs to happen. And organizing around that is a very powerful role for folks like all of us to play in divesting. And I will say, I say the D word in the Jewish community is very loaded, divestment. And I think it is important for the Jewish community to be able to recognize it as a tool. It can be used like anything, organizing. It's like it's a medium. It doesn't necessarily need to take us directly into the Israel-Palestine conversation. And so I think that one of the challenges for the Jewish community is to really own that as a very important strategy, that people don't sort of automatically kind of say, oh, divestment, that's problematic.
Thank you. And Lynn Siegel has had her hand electronically, patiently waving for a while. So if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, Steve, I wondered if I'm going to be the only one that's pushing to get out of the Excel franchise agreement in 2025 and 2024 if they don't meet their emissions. But meantime, I was surprised. So am I going to be the only one? And I was surprised that since there's been, I don't follow national or state politics that much, but since 2018, I'm surprised that it even came about that Excel could pull this fast one on Boulder, considering that you had the Senate at that time. And also considering the financial losses, considering virus, if we can't afford the losses of going with a slow climate change fix like with Excel. So what do you propose?
So, yeah, I would say it's actually very similar to one of the things I was discussing earlier, where the opposition for bolder action often is an amorphous structure that we are complicit in creating. And by that, I mean, it sounds very academic and like, okay, great, we could have like a seminar on that, but what is it actually going to change? By all of this, I mean that, there is Xcel Energy is our big monopoly utility company. And they're one of the largest, if not the largest emitter in the state of Colorado. And the fact that a community can't say, actually, thanks for all of your service, we're going to go elsewhere and buy our power from someone else. The fact that in the United States of America, where we love free markets, that has taken 10 years of taxpayer dollars and court cases and complicated legal maneuvers, and the city eventually had to say, "Look, they've outgunned us, and we no longer can
but we
wage this battle."
Dollars over 20 years. How can
sure? So what I'm saying is that is a structure, right? That is not a Republican opponent. That is a system that we have essentially allowed to use our tax dollars against us in some ways to do things that are not within our own interests. And that is something that, the actual piece that you're referring to on the local level is not something the state Senate can be involved in, because it's a local government issue with Xcel. But what we can do on a state level,
I meant influence with the PUC and with Xcel Energy. Our own mayor turned against us on this issue. Like surely the folks down at the state, there's plenty of networking, and it might not be direct influence, but I'm just stunned that anyone let this happen. Like this was absolutely.
But you know, I don't totally disagree with you, Lynn, but keep in mind, I mean, this was an election. So, you know, more than half of the electorate disagreed with you for one reason or another, and I voted against that as well. Yeah, or people are tired of it, right? And it's just gone on for a long time. Well, and that's a challenge that is similar.
It's going to happen.
Climate.
You know, we used to rent TVs after TV was invented. You know, we rented TVs. This is an archaic structure that isn't going to happen anymore. We aren't going to have public utilities like this. We're going to create our own in the future. So why not do it before the future takes over? And like that Hebrew expression, you know, like the Earth's going to be fine, but how about us? You know, I'm navigating the space-time continuum, and I'm kind of stuck here. So I'd kind of like to preserve my own existence somewhat, you know, selfishly.
Yeah.
But
no,
you know.
I hear you.
Yeah, and I think kind of along the same lines, and these are probably sort of the last questions that we will likely have time to get to. Harry Gregory asked a question for you in the chat. I'll read it because it's kind of up already a bit. People who don't share access to food and water are dying from climate change at the rate of 1 Holocaust per year. We have a moral obligation to do more faster. How do we rise above our political and economic obstacles to implement a true emergency response on a rational timeline, which I think is kind of feeding back to the other piece of the discussion.
Yeah, it's a good question. It is something that I think there's, you know, going back to what I was saying before, government, and this isn't to like, you know, let elected officials off the hook, but government has a role to play, but it's not the only role, right? We as a government can't tomorrow, we maybe legally could, but it's not practical for us to pass a law that says all coal plants are shut down, and you know, nobody can drive their cars anymore, et cetera. That would probably help when it comes to the emissions issue and climate, but it probably will not pass. And, you know, and that's obvious, those are extreme examples, but I guess what I would say is the thing we need to make sure we are doing to make sure that government can be running it, changing policies at the pace that we all know we need it to do, is by talking to our neighbors, by talking to our fellow friends and family members, and especially those who disagree with you. Because again, it's not just Dem versus Republican, but the reason why, you know, me passing a law tomorrow shutting down all the coal plants isn't going to work, it's because there are very well-meaning families and individuals who maybe if we could paint a vision for them and they would like that vision in the end, but it's going to take maybe a decade for them to get to a place that feels like the vision we are trying to sell them. In the short term, they will be out of a job, or they will, you know, we could say we'll retrain them. A lot of these people don't want to be retrained. This is their life. This is what they do. They want to have the dignity of knowing that they have mastered a skill, and this is how they bring money home to their family, right? So we need to make sure we are having those really difficult conversations to get those communities and those people, and then in turn, their elected officials, to be on board with bold actions like flipping a switch and turning off the coal plants. That is how we can end this faster, right? It's not just going to be policy. It's going to be policy because it's something that is something that voters and constituents can stomach, and that they want us to do it.
Thank you. I think that's a really great message. And I'd love to give Rabbi Rosenn kind of a last, 30 seconds around creating that political will, that you're talking about, because I think it brings us around.
Thank you. Well, first of all, just thank you for this wonderful conversation. It feels so important, particularly in this moment, as we stand on the precipice, I think, of this next chapter. And I agree with everything that Senator Fenberg said about the need for us to be bringing people along, and the interplay between the role of activists, the role of nonprofit organizations, the role of government, and the role of different kinds of organizations and activists playing different roles, because that's part of how you also shift the zeitgeist. If you think about how, this goes back to Becky's question about sort of what's changed. Yes, there's sort of the incremental way that you change people's minds and hearts. And then there are those big moments. And I actually go back again to the climate strikes and to the students and to Sunrise. And you think back 3 years ago, completely different landscape, right? There was actually a piece in the New York Times Magazine about Greta Thunberg this week that pointed out 2 years ago, no one knew who she was. So I don't think we should underestimate the kinds of things that we all can be doing that shift the very palette upon which we're all, or canvas that we're all living and working. Because if it's only at the incremental, we won't get there in time. So I want to sort of end where we started, which is really holding that urgency and hope, the sense that it is possible. We have what we need to make this possible, and we have to hold on to that hope, and we have to hold on to the urgency and the creativity of finding the place where those come together to bring about the kind of transformational change that is so needed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we did not get to everyone's questions. I think we could all, enjoy the conversation for much longer, but we want to respect all of your time. So thank you all again for attending, and to David and Linda Bachrach for endowing this symposium, to our two wonderful speakers for taking the time to be here, to the staff of Harshem for coordinating and facilitating this. We hope to be able to, through the magic of email, get a request for feedback to you, so please be on the lookout for that. And I'd like to just leave you also with a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer from her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where she says, "Knowing that you love the earth changes you, activates you to defend and protect and celebrate. But when you feel that the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms the relationship from a one-way street into a sacred bond."